Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this European Commission COP27 side event on international taxonomies. My name is Corinne McHack. I am Director for General Affairs in the European Commission's Directorate General for Financial Stability, Financial Market and Capital Markets Union. And in that role, I'm responsible for international sustainable finance. I'm really honored to be joined by a very distinguished list of speakers on our panels today. I would want to remind everyone this is a live streamed event and that we in this session unfortunately will not have any time for Q&As because we have only 1 hour and a lot of ground to cover. In terms of general introduction to the topic, I think I can be really brief. Everyone knows what an absolute urgency we have now for the transition towards a net zero economy, sustainable finance being a really important part of that work. In the EU, we have been working on a framework with 3 building blocks for quite a few years now, one being disclosures, a second being taxonomy, and a third being tools such as green bonds. Today's event is going to focus on taxonomies. As many of you probably know, taxonomy is a tool for investors to help them to channel their investments towards climate neutral activities, but also towards transition activities. We know where we are, we know where we need to go, but we also need to get there. And we believe that taxonomy is one important tool in that context. Of course, what we do regionally and nationally is really important, but there is such an important international dimension to this whole debate. And that's why we from the EU side really commend the work of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group and our American and Chinese colleagues in that context, and also our own work in the International Platform for Sustainable Finance with many international partners. We have worked a lot on taxonomy. I think the 2 key words here really is interoperability, comparability, or even compatibility between the different approaches taken in by different jurisdictions here. So that is what we're going to discuss in today's event. I will very briefly introduce our speakers. And again, I'm really grateful to all of you for joining this event today. We have Dr. Ma Yun, who is the chairman of the Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking, also the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And Ma Yun has also been absolutely instrumental in the work of the IPSF on taxonomy. So very happy to have him with us today. We then have for the ensuing panel discussion, Carola Moreno, Head of Financial and International Affairs of the Ministry of Finance of Chile. We have Mrs. Suhui Lim, who is Deputy Director of the Sustainability Group at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, where she leads the Capabilities, Enablers and Futures teams, which is part of the Sustainability Group. And they are developing strategies on many issues, including taxonomies. We then have Ayla Cravey, who is Chief Sustainable Finance Advisor of the European Investment Bank. And then also Mr. Anat Krishnan Prasad, who is Unit Chief of the Climate Finance Policy in the Monetary and Capital Markets Department at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So really, I think a mix here of speakers that can share their national experience, but also the experience from some of our most important international organizations. And then last but not least, we will have Sean Kidney from the Climate Bonds Initiative, who will be joining us a little bit later and do the closing remarks of this panel. I need to remind all speakers to be disciplined with your speaking time because we have a lot of subjects to cover and we only have 1 hour. So with that and without further ado, I will now pass the floor to Ma Yun, who will share experiences and also update you on the progress of the work of common ground taxonomies in the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, but also, of course, the Chinese domestic experience. Thank you, and over to you, please, Ma Yun.
Thank you very much, Paulina. Can you hear me okay?
Very well, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you once again. And also, it's my great honor and pleasure to join this discussion on common ground taxonomy. Now, let me try to upload my slides. Just 1 second. Can you see this, Paulina?
Absolutely,
Yeah?
yes.
Great. So as Paulina mentioned, I'm wearing many different hats, including in the IPSF Taxonomy Working Group, G20, and also those in China. But today I'm going to focus on the Common Ground Taxonomy, which is a product of the IPSF Taxonomy Working Group. Now, based on my experience of working on taxonomy in China and helping a couple of other countries, it's clear to me that taxonomy provides an important foundation for the entire green financial system, also small financial system. It at least has the following functions. Number one, it prevents greenwashing by providing a basis for labeling or verification of green activities. And it also provides a basis for performance measurement, for disclosure, for allocation of policy incentives, and for product development. I don't have time to elaborate, but each of these has stories and examples, which I can talk for a long time if you have time. A global challenge that we're facing right now, which is discussed under many platforms, including IPSF, G20, and others, is that a large number of green and sustainable finance taxonomy have popped up. And they're developed by different jurisdictions, different organizations. Some are done by NGOs, by companies, by financial firms. And I was hearing a number of like 200 taxonomies are now available. Now, if many of these are developed in silos, the proliferation of taxonomy may exacerbate a problem such as market segmentation, increase of transaction costs such as green verification costs, and risk of greenwashing, and may undermine the efforts to promote cross-border green capital flows. And to address that problem, in fact, the G20 has recognized the need to make efforts to enhance the comparability, interoperability, and even consistency of taxonomies globally. But the actual or more concrete effort is made by the IPSF. Back 3 years ago, the IPSF, which consists of EU, China, and many other countries, has considered the launch a working group which will work on a taxonomy that's recognized both by China and EU. And this is what we call common ground taxonomy. And in the past 2 years or so, the working group and also the technical expert group under the working group worked out the 2 versions of the common ground taxonomy. The first one was published in November last year during COP26, including 55 mitigation activities recognized both by EU and Chinese taxonomy. And a more recent version, which was released in June this year, included 72 mitigation activities that is consistent with the EU and Chinese taxonomy. Now, here's just a snapshot on a common ground taxonomy table of contents. It's part of that. You can see it covers many activities under agriculture, manufacturing, power, transportation, building, and so on. And the 2 versions have a difference of in terms of number of activities. The second version, as you can see, increase the number of activities, especially in the manufacturing sector and also in the building sector. And here are some examples of activities covered in the first version, which of course stay on the second version. That include wind power, solar power, bioenergy, storage of energy, solid waste treatment, water treatment, renovation of old buildings, low carbon transportation, low carbon water transportation, low carbon air transportation, and so on and so forth. So clearly from those who are familiar with taxonomy, these actually cover the majority of the decarbonization activities in the mitigation space. And now here are just examples of how a detailed description would look like for activities such as wind power and public transportation in the taxonomy. In the second version, as I said, we added 17 new activities, which are largely manufacturing, for example, production of smart grid products and equipment, and the production of fossil fuel equipment, manufacturing of key components of electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. And also in the construction sector, we covered green building, actually part of green building, which are close to net zero. Now, moving on to the use cases. In China and Hong Kong, I've been making a lot of efforts in the past couple of months promoting the usage. And here are 4 type of usage which are being actually implemented, and some of these are being explored. Number one, it's a labeling Chinese green bonds issued in international markets. Quite a few are being issued already, and they are labeled against the CGT or Common Ground Taxonomy. And secondly, approach is being developed to label existing Chinese green bonds. The outstanding Chinese green bonds actually are quite large in terms of number. There are 1,400 green bonds already, and we believe maybe half of these actually qualify CGT and can be labeled against CGT, and then they can be sold more easily in international markets. And some of the verifiers are now beginning to look at labeling these existing green assets in China. And thirdly, we're inviting international issuers to issue green bonds in China, which is called the panda bond market, and they will be invited to consider labeling these bonds against the Common Ground Taxonomy. And finally, the labeling can be done on other products, not just the green bonds. For example, green loans and ABS and green REITs and so on. And some of these green loans are already done by a couple of financial institutions using CGT. And here are just the real examples of the 5 major Chinese banks that have issued the green bonds internationally and used the CGT as the label, including China Construction Bank, Industrial Bank, Bank of China, China Merchant Bank, and also Agriculture Bank has issued one of CGT bond in the domestic Chinese bond market. And here are a couple of international financial firms, including Deutsche Bank and Standard Chartered Bank. They are underwriter of syndicated loans or trade finance projects, which again are labeled against the CGT. So we're beginning to see emergence of a lot of usage of the Common Ground Taxonomy. And of course, there are many other potential usage in terms of research and taxonomy development. The methodology that we developed under the CGT study actually involved a lot of scenarios and a lot of techniques to compare different taxonomy and derive the common activities by the comparison. So such methodologies can be used by other countries to compare their taxonomy with others or benchmark and develop their new taxonomies based on comparison. And the other usage is the CGT can be used as reference or building block for developing new taxonomy by some jurisdictions. For example, Sri Lanka in May this year has developed a green taxonomy which is based on CGT. And Hong Kong has said that they will use the Common Ground Taxonomy as a building block to develop a CGT plus, which is called CGT plus some Hong Kong featured activity as its taxonomy. And some banks in developing countries, such as Habib Bank in Pakistan, has also used the CGT to develop internal taxonomy. And here is a report of Sri Lanka Green Taxonomy, which clearly stated that they used the IPSF Common Ground Taxonomy as a basis. So final remark, it's on the future work of the IPSF Taxonomy Working Group, which I co-chair representing China, and with Marcel Hug from DG FISMA representing Europe. We believe that in the future we can do at least 4 things. Number one, we're going to cover more environmental objectives. So far, as you know, we're covering only mitigation activities. But going forward, we would like to cover activities such as climate change adaptation, pollution prevention and control, biodiversity, and maybe others. And secondly, covering more activities under mitigation activities, for example, covering ICT and professional services. And thirdly, we intend to expand the country basis for taxonomy comparison. As you know, we are currently only comparing China and EU, but some other jurisdictions which are members of IPSF are also interested in joining this exercise. I'm hearing interest from UK, from Singapore. So I believe if some of these countries' taxonomy are ready, we'll welcome their joining into the basis for comparison, which will help us to refine the current version of the CGT. And finally, we'd like to provide capacity building services, working with MDBs and other partners, so that we can help other jurisdictions that are interested in developing taxonomy using CGT as a reference of building block, and also explore ways to work towards enhancing comparability and interoperability of taxonomies of different nations of different regions. So let me stop here, Paulina. Hope I'm not exceeding the limit too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayun. Very comprehensive. Maybe three reflections from me here. One, you mentioned greenwashing, really important. The more, of course, clear standards we have, the better we combat the risk of greenwashing. Also, one other element that came through very interesting in your presentation was that the taxonomy building is very much a dynamic process. And we are ourselves in the EU looking into to expand taxonomy to cover more activities. And I'm sure other jurisdictions are doing the same. And the third point here, which I think is important, is also that we need to cater for the fact that, of course, different countries, different jurisdictions have different starting points, although everyone needs to make the same journey in the end. We're now going to move to our to the second part, if you wish, of this session, which is with the national perspective from Chile and from Singapore. And the first question that I'm going to ask to Carola and to Suri is to ask them to very briefly, maximum 5 minutes, illustrate a little bit what's happening on the taxonomy front in their national context. So I will start with Carola and the situation in Chile. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I hear you well, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you for allowing us to show the experience in Chile. So the origin of the work we're doing right now was in what we call like the private-public green finance roundtable. So we have there all financial and regulatory agencies, plus the Central Bank of Chile and the Ministry of Finance guiding this table. And we work together it's nothing non-binding, it's a collaborative work. With all the associations of the financial system, banks, insurance companies, financial institutions. So from there, the need to have an identification of what is environmental and sustainable activity and how to direct investment there, how to finance these activities. This idea was born and of course inspired by what was going on in the European Union here. In other regions, Colombia is also one place in the region where this is going from. So we built a roadmap, and from there we started and built on a committee that is only on the public sector, that so collects all this interest from the private sector, concerns, ideas. And we work collaboratively in this committee in which we have the same group that of institutions I just mentioned, but also the Ministry of Environment. We've been working on 5 core elements, okay? So not building the taxonomy itself, but we're working on the building blocks, okay? So defining what the objective of the taxonomy should be, what should be the way of classification, or what type of activities we want to have there, the driving principles, like very broad principles, and I'm emphasizing here because objectives and driving principles is something that we can, from where we can work on in order to have comparability among different taxonomies. And then we worked on what should be the governance in order to build, in fact, the taxonomy. And this was a very difficult item to work on because of what you just mentioned. This is going to be dynamic. So we need, to have a sort of like a institutionality to see who is going to decide on all the previous elements I just mentioned. And finally, whether this taxonomy should be legally enforced or not. So now we just finished that technical work. we're going to make a proposal to the Ministry of Finance. And from there, we're going to start our work into building the actual taxonomy.
Thank you very much, Carla. Very interesting also what you were saying in terms of setting out with something which is more principle-based, which you can then render potentially more granular and more prescriptive as you gain further experience. So very, very interesting. So we now turn to the Singapore experience with the same question. If you could please share with us, Suyu, some of the latest development in Singapore in the development of taxonomies. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Paulina. Greetings from Singapore, and thank you for this opportunity to speak at this event. So maybe I'll just begin by really setting the context in terms of where we are on this journey. Singapore is firmly committed to climate change and doing our part in this global effort to fight the climate crisis. And just 2 weeks ago, we have committed to to raise our climate ambitions to achieve net zero by 2050. We have also enhanced our 2030 nationally determined contributions, or NDC. And the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or MAS, has been promoting the growth of green and transition finance in really to support Asia's transition to net zero. And supporting taxonomy development has been a key feature of Singapore's sustainable finance efforts. And having a common language to define green and transition activities will really move the needle in terms of scaling up cross-border sustainable finance flows and transition to a low carbon economy. And in Singapore, MAS is also really developing a green and transition taxonomy. And this is led by an industry task force, the Green Finance Industry Task Force in Singapore, to help guide Singapore-based financial institutions, even as they make loans to different players in Singapore as well as the region. And this is really also to help to mitigate the risk of greenwashing. And our approach in Singapore has been to build on the strong work done in other jurisdictions such as the EU and China, but at the same time customizing where necessary for Singapore as well as Asia's unique context. And such approach is critical to build compatibility with existing taxonomies, while keeping in mind that the region where we are operating in has a different starting point. And 85% of the energy produced in Asia actually still comes from fossil fuels, and many sectors are still emissions intensive. So we must find creative ways to transit towards greater sustainability while securing economic and social development. So just to share a bit more about our taxonomy, which is aligned to the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degrees by 2050 pathway. And it classifies activities according to a traffic light system. So sustainable activities are classified as green, transition activities as amber, and unsustainable activities as red. And a key feature of this Singapore taxonomy is that it covers transition activities, and it allows progressive shift towards greater sustainability, taking into account the different starting points of the ASEAN region. And so an example is that of an activity being considered as transition would be natural gas. And given that, natural gas is, electricity generation in Singapore, 95% of it is still relying on natural gas. But at the same time, we are cognizant that it's important for the amber or transition thresholds to be calibrated carefully, such that you show that the activities are actually transiting towards green within a certain time frame, and it shows that progressively there are emissions reductions in the short term. So the calibration of the taxonomy is important, and taking into account the availability of alternative technologies in Singapore and the region. And this would have to be reviewed at regular intervals to keep pace with innovations. So in terms of progress, happy to share that we have gone through a few phases of work. The first phase, the industry-led task force has defined environmental objectives under the taxonomy and identified 8 focus sectors, covering around 90% of the ASEAN greenhouse gas emissions. And in the second phase of work, recently in May this year, we have issued for public consultations the second version of our taxonomy, which sets out technical activity level thresholds for the classification of 3 focus sectors, buildings, energy, and transportation. And currently we are in progress to work on the remaining 5 sectors. And these 5 sectors include areas such as agriculture, industrial, and other enabling activities. And we are aiming to release the thresholds for public consultation in early next year, and with a view to really finalize a full taxonomy covering the environmental objective of climate change mitigation by 2023. So I'll pause here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that perspective, and also I think pointing out the fact that, of course, indeed, different regions are starting from different starting points, and I think that's something which is a little bit like running as a common feature through this discussion. I'm now going to go back to Carola, and again, please try to be brief because we don't have so much time. And this is moving a little bit now from the domestic perspective to the international perspective. Both Chile and Singapore are members of our international platform for sustainable finance. So I guess my question to you is a little bit, how can we work even better together at the international level, and also what are the challenges in that context? Over to you, please, Carola.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Since we're in an initial step, but we already did like a very thorough work on which am I okay with the camera? Okay. So we did a very thorough work in terms of learning what's out there, but in this process of building, the main elements and trying to design what we want to do, we realized, and we are facing now all the complexities that we were told we were going to face. So we're actually there. And in that sense, I think we would benefit mostly is to learn about what we shouldn't do. For instance, one can fall into the trap of trying to identify too many activities, for instance. Things need to be verifiable. There's also the need to get some supervision. I mean, we want to avoid greenwashing, so we don't want to make it too complex as to the point that you cannot verify. And so the tool will not actually help you fight that problem. So, being in a platform like this allows to share this type of knowledge and get some common ground. Let's say elements in which from where to work on. And another point, I mean, of course, we want to go to interoperability, but something that is very important for us is working on this platform and having a discussion and collaborative work. It's to get to a point of consensus in which no taxonomy is imposed over another one. I think country realities allow for this heterogeneity, so there's a very challenging balance in which local realities need to be acknowledged, but at the same time, and that's where we want to go, interoperability. I mean, that taxonomies actually can talk to each other. So for us, I think that would be where we would benefit the most, the 2 things I mentioned. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And I think indeed one of the ideas in the platform is precisely to exchange best practices and trying to avoid maybe to fall in the pitfalls that others have done already. But obviously this is very challenging, and that's why I think having this conversation at an international level is so important. I will now turn to Singapore again, and again briefly on the same question, the international cooperation and the various challenges in that context.
Yeah, I would talk about it from both the regional as well as the global level. So I think more broadly, I think we are unlikely to see a single global taxonomy, but as jurisdictions develop their own taxonomies, we must ensure that they are compatible and interoperable. And this is something that we are, as we design and develop our taxonomy, it's something that we are very mindful of. And the Singapore taxonomy is really designed to be as consistent as possible with other international taxonomies, with particular focus on the EU taxonomies, as well as China taxonomies with matrix and thresholds designed along the same lines, but at the same time mindful that it has to be tailored to and to be usable to the ASEAN and the Southeast Asia region. So at a regional level, MES is the vice chair of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, and that's really currently also involved in developing a multi-tier ASEAN taxonomy to guide transition financing flows in this region. And it's also looking to publish a second version of their ASEAN taxonomy in the next few months. And at a global level, really echoing what the other panelists, the speakers have said, that the important efforts of IPSF to develop this common ground taxonomy will really help to enhance transparency by highlighting commonalities across the different existing taxonomies. And it also provides a very useful framework as well as methodologies for different taxonomies, whether they are at the starting to develop it, whether they are thinking about it, how do we achieve this interoperability and comparability. And when the Singapore taxonomy is ready, we do hope that we can also join the commonalities exercise under the IPSF. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. I think it's interesting because it's so clear that we have a very common shared objective here. It is a little bit difficult to get there, but I think a lot has been done and clearly still a lot of work ahead of us too. So thank you so much to Carola and to Suhui for these very insightful comments. We're now moving to the third part of the panel, and we of course stay in the international perspective here because that is what this session is all about. But we are going to move on to the perspective from two very important international players, one being the European Investment Bank, the other being the International Monetary Fund. And also in this part of the session, we will have two questions. And the first question to both Ayla and Anna Krishnan is a little bit building on what we have discussed already. How can you in your respective activities kind of help to develop these comparable, compatible, interoperable taxonomies? So a little bit putting this discussion in your, let's say, multilateral organization / multilateral investment bank perspective. And I'll ask Ayla to comment first, please.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think what I've heard, first of all, so far from all the previous speakers, I think it's fantastic, all the work that is going on. So it's great to hear. Now, what MDBs can do to support and promote. First of all, of course, in the group of MDBs, EIB is in a slightly different position compared to the peers because we are the only one who has got a small group of shareholders who all share the same regulatory environment. So for us, it's very easy to say that, okay, we are committed to the EU taxonomy because we only have one when we talk about sort of regulatory environments. And other MDBs, obviously, they have multiple and much more shareholders, and they have multiple regulatory environments to live with as well. Of course, this changes when one goes outside Europe. But I think when we talk about common taxonomies, I think we have to be, first of all, realistic and be careful that the perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good, because getting a global, all-encompassing taxonomy, which everybody shares, is probably a bit early days for that, and it's a big target, which I think is difficult to reach. But what we on our side would love to see, what we have been promoting, I think also even earlier, we're together with Dr. Ma before, is that we would see a similar kind of architecture and methodology in the taxonomies, which then helps enormously the comparability and the interoperability. You don't need to have similar thresholds, similar criteria, but having a similar looking framework would help a lot. And we have seen already that some countries have based their national taxonomies on the same framework as the EU is. I know about Colombia, UK, even South Africa apparently as well. I know that Colombia added one objective there, land use, which is important for them. So this is the kind of development I think which is very good to see from an MDB point of view, who has to operate globally. That is one thing. I would also hope that MDBs and our peers who give advice to governments across the world about how to develop taxonomies, that they would have this in mind, that let's not split the scene into too many parts, but let's keep a similar kind of architecture in mind. And architecture is really all I'm thinking about. I don't sort of expect everybody to have similar criteria. Now, secondly, and this is where it gets more complicated, because all I think we have heard before on the comparison of the taxonomies, it happens at the level of the substantial contribution criteria. But when we go to the do no significant harm, that's when it gets interesting, of course. And especially outside the EU, for us, for anybody, it gets quite complicated. We have been involved with this taxonomy work since the beginning, and we are now working on our own environmental and social standards to become compatible to the DNSH framework. And I think there are other MDBs who are doing similar kind of projects. And ideally, if the MDBs who look at their own criteria and standards could work a little bit together, I think that would be a very powerful message to the market, because if you have MDBs agree on something, then it's really very authoritative and very, very sort of a good message to send. We have worked before on climate finance tracking methodology, which admittedly it's a bit less challenging, but there are examples of work that have been done together. And if I can remind, the platform for sustainable finance, not the international one, but the one that advises the Commission. We did recommendations in the usability report that was released a month ago, that EC, and when I'm talking about EC, it's sometimes the Commission itself or Commission within the international platform, that one would develop mappings between EU-based technical criteria and labeling schemes to the most widely used international standard, and building on the work that has been done by us, by the European Development Finance institutions, by the OECD Rio markers, by the IFC performance standards, and so on and so on. And this is clearly something that MDBs could join this work to help them. And another recommendation was that particularly IPSF members would create a list of near zero energy buildings and performance certificates, the international equivalencies, by mapping the quality level and level of implementation of the energy efficiency and green building labels outside EU. Because many of us, we finance energy efficiency outside Europe in many, many countries. And these things are just not comparable at the moment. This is also something that MDBs could help with, because we are present in this market in so many countries. So a couple of proposals there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for mentioning the usability, because I think that is really important. I mean, what kind of filters through always in this discussion is that all this is quite complicated. And of course, we are not putting all these methodologies and architectures in place for the sake of ourselves. We are putting it in place for actually users and investors and companies and institutions to be able to use them. So I think that's something we are certainly also looking into. How can we make this easier to use in a way and maybe slightly less complex? At the same time, we are in a world which is very complex, so our rules will have to be a little bit complex as well. But now turning to the IMF perspective, with in a way with the same question, and what would be your perspective? What are the challenges here, and how can multilateral organizations help? Please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So let me elaborate on why the IMF is involved in this issue of climate taxonomies. Strengthening the information architecture is of global imperative to support the transition to climate sustainable economy and to address the need for information on climate related risks. So in this context, the relationship between taxonomies and disclosures and the need to enhance the efficiency and scientific relevance of information for the sound and robust development of sustainable finance need hardly be underscored. Now, taxonomies serve very important purposes. These include transparency, benchmark for capital allocation and transition planning in view of climate and environmental objectives, and anti-greenwashing functions. So their value lies in the possibility to provide the standardized and science-based classification of activities based on their carbon intensity. It also allows financial markets to differentiate between high and low carbon assets, and therefore to assess the impact of low carbon investment strategies in terms of composition of the real economy. Now, the proliferation of alignment approaches, including taxonomies globally, has resulted in culmination in their application, their underlying methodologies, and applicable objectives. Ultimately, these may not serve the objective of aligning global capital flows in a low carbon trajectory. So in 2021, the Sustainable Finance Working Group of G20, where Marjun is a co-chair, they published 6 high-level principles for the development of alignment approaches, and they relate to the fundamental topics for the design of taxonomies. For example, they have a do no significant harm principle, they have a science-based nature for reference points, and the inclusion of transition pathways. In fact, in 2022, Sustainable Finance Working Group's main focus is on transition frameworks. So the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF, and the BIS, we have undertaken the task to write the guidelines for operationalizing the principles for these 6, operationalizing these 6 principles that the Sustainable Finance Working Group has outlined. And this would probably provide a clear direction, practicable options, and guidance to support the implementation. And our major goal is to improve comparability and interoperability across diverse taxonomies and asset level approaches. There are many alignment approaches, portfolio and asset, but here we are focusing on the asset level approaches. Just a final few words on what we are actually focusing on while writing these guidelines. We are focusing on mainly climate related issues, but some important aspects of other sustainability categories would also, for instance, biodiversity and ecosystems can also be integrated at a later stage. We are also trying to provide practical solutions to better embed supply chains and the conditions of emerging market in these taxonomies. And our work is also organized around comparative analysis around all existing taxonomies. We have a literature review, and we are identifying some technical issues in high-level principles. So we are adopting a methodology where we are comparing taxonomies, and for each of these 6 principles, we are seeing that what works, what has been working well, so that these will provide some minimum ground taxonomies. So I'll stop here at this point. And this report will come very soon, and it will be in public domain. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think these guidelines, that's of course really, really important, interesting. And thank you also for mentioning disclosure. I mean, that's of course a subject which we unfortunately don't have time to cover in this session. We had a European Commission, a COP side event this morning, actually precisely about disclosure, where we had in a way exactly the same debate. How can we ensure that the various standards, regional and international, are as compatible and interoperable as possible in that area, bearing in mind that the EU is probably a little bit ahead in terms of already having quite prescriptive and far-reaching reporting and disclosure rules on the rule books. But that's another debate. And coming back to Ayla briefly, you have touched on it a bit already, actually, how in terms of what are the challenges you see at EIB, and you mentioned, for example, the need to have a similar architecture, if not exactly the same activities being covered. But if there's anything you want to add to that in terms of challenging, but also, of course, how the EIB, with, as you rightly said, is a bit of a special setup compared to others, but still you have activities across very many jurisdictions. So how could you yourself also contribute to these interoperability between taxonomies?
Indeed, I can still continue on the topic, so I didn't exhaust my list. And of course, when you talk about taxonomy, I mean, but like I said, we have been involved from the beginning, but it doesn't mean that we get a free ride, not at all. We work hard on it like everybody else. And since we, for example, follow EU regulation and legislation in all the environmental sense, then some things are very familiar to us already. But when we sort of implement this within the EU, the hardest part, even in the EU, is the do no significant harm part. And there, I think the platform made some general recommendations which are applicable wherever in the world we are talking about things. So, for example, we had, and this is something that I hear also from other banks, from investors, etc. When there's something very clear, like the emission target, for example, do no significant harm to climate change mitigation, is 270 grams per kilowatt hour. That's very clear. And that's something that I think most people don't even have a big problem with. But if I look at the platform recommendations, we had, for example, one should ensure that all testing criteria in the DNSH, they actually have yes or no outcome so that you have a clear answer, either this complies or this doesn't comply, and that's it. And one should minimize maybe the subjective language, because there are some criteria which say that you should maximize or minimize something, or be careful that you don't or do, and try to assure. So this is very difficult to judge whether it is or not. And we have to keep in mind that many of these things will be sort of verifiable. So the verifier needs to know whether it's yes or no. They can't judge if it's best efforts. So that is something, and I think the Commission and maybe the next platform and so on will work on this. And then when we go again outside the EU and into the emerging markets, developing economies, I refer to what I already said earlier about the equivalencies and labelings. That's very important. But there's some additional wishes. So if you allow me, if the IPSF could, for example, develop and validate a mapping between statistical system in different countries, to have a common understanding on environmental metrics and their calculation methodologies. This sounds very basic, but it is actually in the everyday work, it becomes quite important. Of course, if Commission manages to incentivize and encourage other jurisdictions to include at least the DNSH and the minimum social safeguards concepts into the methodologies, into their taxonomies, even if the criteria, again, are not the same, it helps the understanding. And what one has as an idea behind these recommendations, for example, on the platform, is very clear. It's all about data, data, data. And it's not for nothing that we see now so many small companies and large companies who set up businesses to provide data, sustainability data here and environmental data there and social data. But even sometimes the data itself doesn't help if it's not comparable between jurisdictions, if we have different metrics and different statistical systems or no statistical system at all. So that was about the complaint side. Opportunity, first and foremost, the main reason why we have been great supporters and promoters of this idea of taxonomy from the day one and even before. It finally tells us what can be considered green, or to be more precise, having a substantial contribution, and that is so important. Before it was just about anybody's definition, now you can challenge that. And even there are still questions, there are complexities, there's not enough of granularity maybe and all that, but it's still a huge, huge step forward. So I think it's a magnificent work. And then I can still add that now that we have defined substantial contribution for at least quite a lot of things or sectors in terms of climate, and other objectives are coming, hopefully next year. What the financial market now is really needing is similar kind of definitions for the transition. And when I talk about transition, I talk about transition out of the significantly harmful activities into the middle zone, which means in plain language, kind of a level that we can live with. So we call this in the platform report the amber transition. But I think this is very important because people are afraid of doing something which is called greenwashing if they don't have these definitions. And that is a real risk. I think we saw this 2 years ago. People started to do a lot of transition finance, and it was really transition finance. So with that wish list, thank you, Paulina.
Well, thank you very much, Ayla. Thank you for being so concrete. I think there is clearly a follow-up conversation to be had on many of these points. Thank you also for mentioning data. That is, of course, really left, right, and center of this debate. And I think we've seen that from the very beginning when we started out with our first high-level expert group on sustainable finance back in 2017, 2018. That was already back then identified as one of the issues. And of course, as we know, we've made progress, but there is still a lot to be done there. We don't turn back briefly also to the IMF. I mean, I think in a way, I think you've already touched quite well on what the IMF is doing in terms of contributing to this interoperability and compatibility globally that we have been speaking about with your forthcoming report and guidelines. But is something else you would want to add in that context, also looking at the work of our international platform that many other colleagues on the call have referred to, or of course also the discussions at the G20?
Sure, thanks. So I just wanted to put it in the bigger context of how the IMF is looking at this, right? So climate change is an existential threat, and it's also macro critical for us. And the financing gap is running into trillions, right? So there is an urgent need that you have both policies and financing. Now, on the policy side, that we are pushing a couple of things. One is you need a clear and credible signal, right, of financing coming in. So at the end of it, why are we talking of data and disclosures and taxonomy? So that all countries get enough money so that they move into a more sustainable path and decarbonization, right? So one is the policies. Let's say carbon pricing or any equivalents, or so all these things will give a credible path. The second thing is the information architecture. So without us developing an information architecture of data, taxonomies, and disclosures, money is not going to come in. There's not going to be capital flows into these economies. So that's where we are basically coming from. And the design of common ground taxonomy is very important so that there can be global capital flows in an easy way and in a cost-effective way. So there are three things that we are focusing on in the information architecture space. I already mentioned the taxonomies. After we develop the guidelines, then we will start supporting authorities in developing alignment approaches, and then through policy as well as technical assistance. That's the next step that we'll get into. Bridging data gaps, we led an NGFS working group which came out with the data directory. The next step is to see that how to keep that data directory live. The IMF is also coming out with has also got a climate dashboard. Again, that's on the macro variables. Again, very extremely important for aligning the capital flows. And then we are also committed with the IFRS and the ISSB for disclosures. The final point is we have a new lending facility, that is the resilience and sustainable finance. We are giving long-term financing to countries. One of the important things there is we need to scale up private finance, and that is not going to happen unless the reforms are in place. So a major focus through our conditionality and reforms will be data architecture. We have to make sure that countries that take RSF from us will improve their data, they will improve their climate risk stress testing and their risk analysis. They will have some taxonomies that they develop so that at the end of it, there is scaling up of climate finance. So I just wanted to bring the bigger picture under which we are entering this, the reason why the IMF is here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I really feel that we would need at least 5 hours follow-up sessions because we've been covering so much ground here and so many diverse dimensions also to this debate. But thank you in particular also bringing in this aspect of, yes, the funding needs are, of course, really, really big. And we all know that public finance is not enough. We need to really make sure that we get the private finance in as well. But at the same time, in order to do so, you really need to have this conducive policy and regulatory framework. So I think thanks again for making kind of that point and bringing the two together. That I think that is really very much the core of this debate. I have to thank all speakers for having been very, very, very disciplined with time. I think we managed to cover an enormous amount of ground in a very short period of time. I know, or I've been told at least, that Sean has been able to join us, and I know that I'm giving him the ungrateful task of concluding a discussion where I know that you have been able to follow only partially because you've been kind of multitasking and following another debate and conference in parallel. Sean, I will hand over to you to just share with us a couple of reflections from your perspective. I think what I take from this debate, which again was extremely interesting, is that there is, and I think that's very encouraging, there is such a common vision of what we are trying to achieve. At the same time, it's also clear that we see that different jurisdictions are in different places fighting with the same issues. But what I take here is really that we need to continue to have these international global conversations, because in a way the best way of building these the catchwords of comparability, interoperability, and compatibility. It's really that we work very closely together and have these possibilities to really exchange best practices and learn from each other. But with that, I will hand over to you, please, Sean.
Thanks, Paulina. I'm at the COP where reception is terrible. So I'll leave you to tell me if this connection becomes a problem. I've got here the Chinese, along with the English spelling of climate bonds, as I guess a testament of the cooperative work we've done in Europe with China when it comes to taxonomy. The Common Ground taxonomy, published by the European Commission and the People's Bank of China together, is an example of working on harmonization, and we'll see more of that. But first, I need to check, Paulina, can you hear me?
I hear you well. Your image is freezing a little bit, but at least I can hear you.
Great. Let me pursue my thoughts then. To massively grow capital flows, to achieve our critically important 2030 targets, which is the discussion in COP that we're having here in Europe and in all the countries that have now committed to 2030 targets, we need to have clarity about what to do. We don't have time to get muddled in confusion, such as what kind of agriculture or what kind of industrial qualifies or energy. The taxonomy is about making things easier for everyone to move rapidly, to move quickly. And we know that in financial markets, clarity and commoditization, standardization, speeds activity. So we're certainly counting on the taxonomy speeding things up from now on, rather than drawing back. And that applies, of course, to the other sustainable finance action plan measures that we're taking in Europe. And I say we because I'm a proud citizen of the European Commission, very proud of the sustainable finance action plans that the Commission has pursued. Once we do that, we can have incentives and support aligned across taxonomies with a multiplying amplification effect as a result. And then we need to move on to the tough job, which is how we develop new assets consistent with taxonomy, whether that be energy, transport, or industrial. In Europe, for example, 70% of steel plants are coming to the end of their life in the next 7 years. They all need to be rebuilt. We need to ensure they're rebuilt consistent with taxonomy, not consistent with old technologies. The taxonomy work in Europe has been incredibly influential. It's gone global. 30 countries around the world now are working on taxonomies or have published them. Many of those are participating in the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, the EU's initiative, working groups around taxonomy. In this idea that we've taken global, there is 2 key points to remember. This is not relative ESG. This is about painting absolute measures. It's a shopping list for the future. It's not about the best-in-class coal plants. It's a different conception to what we've been using in the past. And it's not just CO2. It's enabling investments to support decarbonisation, and it's resilience and adaptation as well. So critical features in this new framework. We clearly need to move very quickly on raising capital. We have the capital pools available. This is an important part of the architecture of ensuring that capital starts shifting more rapidly towards the green. We're currently at about $1.5 trillion US a year of flows into climate. We need to be, according to McKinsey's, at $9.2 trillion a year just on the mitigation side. So there is a long way to go. But this is incredibly important architecture, and gone global in a way we're using the same principles. It looks complicated. It looks like everyone's wearing different clothes, but everyone is wearing the same cut of cloth. They're using the same principles. They are referencing the European taxonomy. And now we need to make that clearer and evident to the market in the coming year, but we're well on the way to achieving that interoperable, harmonised universe. So watch this space, I suppose, is the answer. It's so important. Thanks for having the chance to make a few comments. Good luck, everyone, in implementing the taxonomy and doing the most important thing, transitioning our planet to be low carbon and climate resilient.
Thank you so much, Sean, for being sobering and encouraging at the same time as always. I think that was a very helpful kind of closing of what has been a really, really interesting discussion. We are spot on time, I think, and I really want to thank all our really distinguished and excellent speakers that joined us in this session. And also, again, thanks to you, Sean, for wrapping it up in such an efficient way. So thanks again to all of you, and good luck to all of us to quote what Sean just said, and have a very good rest of the day for everyone. And thanks again for joining the European Commission on this side event at the COP. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.